Now, in terms of political risk for business, Nigeria and 17 other African states are classified as secure and stable investment destinations for multinationals. This was stated in the Africa Country Instability Risk Index study just released by SBM Intelligence. Botswana, Mauritius, South Africa, Namibia and Tanzania are some of the countries deemed safe. A number of countries were also deemed stable for investment in the report. Now, joining me to discuss this further is Tunde Ajileye, partner, SBM Intelligence. Many thanks for joining us on the show this morning, Tunde. Good morning.
Good morning.
Great. All right, let's begin. We have quite a bit to get through. Let's begin with an overview of this report and what it represents. What should we know about it?
So the report is a framework that we've created to be able to quantify in some manner the risk of investing in certain destinations in Africa on a country by country basis. You find that many investors say things like they're unable to quantify risk and therefore they place a higher premium on comparable African countries to other OECD countries. You find a country like Botswana, for example, paying 400, 300 basis points more than its counterparts that have exactly the same indices in other parts of the world. So what we try to do with this report is to quantify all of those risks and categorize them so that in an empirical form, so that stakeholders can look at a report like this and say, yes, this is a safe place, and therefore I don't need to create an extra risk premium when I'm going into this country. It can help in terms of all other types of planning, interventions, and the likes. And it's a live report, it's a live framework such that happenings that occur on an ongoing basis can then feed into the indicators so that it can update as soon as those events occur that will impact on the risk assessment. There are four broad indicators and 21 sub-indicators under those broad indicators that we track to be able to produce this report.
All right, well understood. Now, before we get into more granular details, could you speak to some of these key indicators you've just mentioned of instability, and at what point, more importantly, is a country declared unstable?
Right. So there are four broad indicators: leadership and governance, the economy, geopolitics, and the history of the area. And we think from all of the work that we've done, and we have quite some experience in creating indexes like this. We have the Jollof Index that we've done for 10 years. We have the Health Preparedness Index that we've done for another 5 years. So we do have experience in creating this kind of indexes. Now, what we've done is to apply weight to these things as they impact and are important to the stability and the risk, sovereign risk of a nation. So you can have a nation that has exactly the same geopolitics and the same, history, but because of leadership and governance, that nation takes a different route from another. So we've put a bigger weight on leadership and governance, for example, at 40%. We've put some more on economics, which is 30%, and then history and geopolitics take 15%, because all of these have an impact on the stability of the country. Some of the kind of sub-indicators we have under this are things along the lines of, is it a democracy or an autocracy? And what spectrum does it stay? How long has the ruler stayed in power? What is the transfer of power like in the place? Is it acrimonious? Is it smooth? Do they have a consistent history of transfer of power without violence? Under the economy, what are the economic indicators? What's poverty like? What's inflation like? What's their currency performance like? What is infrastructure like? All of the things that power the economy. How do those things feature? Under the geopolitics, what are the geopolitical interests that play in that nation, of the big superpowers, of the regional powers? What are the resources that drive global interest in that nation, and all of those kinds of things. Under history, we have things like, have there been coups? Is there violence? Have there been civil wars? Have there been, and how far back did these happen? How were they resolved? And what do these feed into the ethnic composition of the area? And so we take a broad look using all of these indicators to then create a predictive framework to say, if these things hold in this way, then this is the likelihood of instability in this location. And if any of these indicators change in this manner, then the risk will change. So for example, if there is no coup in 5 years, it's a different scenario for if there was a coup last year or last 2 years. If there is no natural resource, if it's not a monoproduct economy, it's a different scenario from if it's a monoproduct economy. And all of those kind of things are the things that feed into this work.
Right, quite a number of factors there, I see. But could you speak a bit more to the methodology and approach towards this report, especially with respect to the volatility and vulnerability of each country as highlighted?
All right, thank you very much. So we looked at, for example, things along the lines of each of those indicators. We collated the data points for each of those indicators. So, for example, we collated all of the economic data points. We collated all of the historical data points. We collated all of the geopolitical data points, and of course, all of the leadership and governance data points. And then we applied weights to this. So on a spectrum of 0 to 5, where do these types of things fall? And we defined this before we started collecting data within the framework. Based on all of that, you can come up with what the final output for each country would look like. So some countries, for example, do well in economics, but don't do well in leadership and governance. Some countries do well in leadership and governance, but they have a geopolitical problem or a historical problem. And all of those feed into the final outcome for each of those countries. So you have a country like DRC, for example, that falls flat on almost all of the indexes. It has a geopolitical problem because there is resources that have global powers interested, and those resources are concentrated in specific parts of the country. And so those kinds of things feed into the geopolitical problem it has. You have the leadership and governance problem. Everybody knows the leadership and governance issues, coups, instability, transition is violent, and all of those kind of things that feature for Democratic Republic of Congo. It has the historical problems as well, but those historical problems actually have not been as recent as people think. Kabila had a long reign, and there was transfer of power to his successor, without as much violence as most people would expect for a place like DRC. So it featured a bit better in terms of that particular indicator. But when you put all of this together, then you see that it ultimately was the worst performing country in terms of investment, destination in Africa. You have other countries that do well, like Botswana, for example, or South Africa, which perform better on each of these indicators. And then when you aggregate them together, you realize that it does much better than, a country like DRC, for example. So that's the methodology an approach that we took. And we were very, very detailed and very deliberate. And we made sure that all of the data was backed up by empirical facts so that it is based on the actuality in each of those countries. And we take this very seriously because we know that there are a lot of stakeholders that consume reports like this, and it impacts their investment decisions. It impacts the risk that they assess the countries with. It impacts even the rates at which, the kind of returns that they expect from their investments in the countries and all of that. So we take this very serious.
Absolutely. And it does really seem very detailed. It appears very detailed. But when we look at the macro risk indicators, particularly in relation to the economy and geopolitics, and I know you touched on this earlier, what interactions exist between these two comparatively across African countries? Because that could be, neither here nor there sometimes.
Right. So, one of the things that you see when you look at the overall map is you almost see the problem of Africa very, very vividly when you look at the overall map. So the big economies in Africa, in East Africa, you have Kenya. In Southern Africa, you have South Africa and, its surrounding countries. In West Africa, you have Nigeria. And you find that if you look across the Sahel, it's all red. All the places that, Nigeria, for example, should use to trade with all the other trading blocks, it's cut off in terms of trade. If you look at Kenya as well, all of its surroundings is cut off in terms of land trade. If you look at Southern Africa, it's cut off in terms of land trade. So the corridors through Central Africa, the corridors through the Sahel, that should be the backbone of trade in Africa, it's cut off. It's one of the reasons why Africa's trade is only maritime out of Africa. And this is one core geopolitical point that comes out when you look at this report. Secondly, you look at the interests, global interests. We have the recent coups in Niger, for example, and you will see how interests played out differently because of geopolitical interest from places like Burkina Faso and Mali. Those have an impact on stability of the countries. And when the geopolitical interests have those kind of connotations, then you see it come out in leadership and governance, the kind of support that is given to autocratic regimes, which will not be if those geopolitical interests did not exist. And that translates obviously into poor governance, which translates into economic problems, and ultimately it just makes those countries more risky to go into, and it makes them more prone to instability because the wealth in the country is then concentrated in very small pockets, and it becomes a big price for people to try to create instability to win. Whereas where you have more widespread economic opportunity, where you have better governance, where you have better management of geopolitical interests, then you find that the wealth is more widespread and there is not a huge incentive to, win those prizes. The most stable places in Africa are the places where Africans trade with each other. And that may be the biggest takeaway from this report, that the key to stability is fixing, the corridors of trade that should happen within Africa, along the Sahel, within Central Africa, so that it can take trade from Southern Africa into the Eastern Africa, into Western Africa, and back and forth. That needs to happen in Africa, and that's what this report is saying.
Absolutely. And it does sound extremely interesting when we look at the dynamics that play. I wish we had so much more time to get into some more nitty-gritty on it. But let's, in wrapping up, what is your overall outlook on African economics grappling with, political, socio-economic, environmental and security challenges?
We take a view as a firm that, Africa seems to be tending towards what happened in the early 60s, where there is a demographic change and there is economic challenges, and the global geopolitical situation has also changed so that interests are more naked. And we see that in the Middle East already, and we saw it in Africa, the Niger example I gave. Because geopolitical interests have become more naked, what you then have is that all of the things like, support for democracy that would have been par the core, before now, have become clad in those naked interests, so that all of the big geopolitical players will only intervene, and support when their interests are at stake. But you have this situation where Africa is experiencing an economic winter. We're having a demographic bulge. It's very similar to the 1960s, and it's part of the reason why we've seen a rise in coups across certain parts of Africa. We need to, arrest these issues and approach the world with the knowledge of this new reality. It's a new reality where in a multipolar world, interest will become more important, and Africa needs to engage the world from that perspective so that we get the best deals, we get the best transactions, we get the best things for African interests across Africa.
Absolutely, Tunde. It's been such an absolute pleasure having a chat with you. Fascinating work, and well done to you and your team at SBM Intelligence for working on this report. Many thanks for joining the show.